You're listening to the Family Podcast from PursueGOD.org.
Well, parents, today we are going to cover a harder topic. It's something that's come up in our parenting small group, and that is, how do you talk to kids about grief and loss and death? And so I read a couple books. I just thought this might be a really helpful topic for those of you out there that maybe are in the midst of losing a loved one or have just gone through, just finished up burying someone that you cared about and your kids are asking questions, or maybe your parents out there are just wondering when that day comes, would you be ready to have those conversations? So I hope this is going to be helpful for you today. The book that I read that I got a lot of information from, his name is Alan Wolfelt, and the book is called Finding the Words. And he's like a forerunner in grief and death and how to talk to people and help people process through grief. So I figure he's got some pretty good things to say. So I'm just going to share some of those insights with you. And we're going to just start by talking about just some general thoughts about grief and loss, and just making sure that even as adults and as parents, you guys have an understanding, because maybe some of you haven't really had to go through death and loss and grief yet. Or maybe you have and you don't feel like you've done it very well. Maybe it's still very raw and real to you. And so the thought of having to talk to your kids about it, you just don't even know if you could ever find the words. So hopefully this is going to be helpful for you. In my life, I haven't had a ton of loss. I feel very grateful for that. I've lost grandparents, but they were, in their 90s. So it was the so-called appropriate time. They had lived a full and good life. I have lost a few friends to cancer way beyond the year that they should have passed. They were in their 40s. I've also known a young woman in her 20s. And so I have experienced it in different ways. Some of those relationships, I was closer to people and more involved in the process than others. But thankfully for our parents on both my husband's side and my side are both still living. My children haven't really had to experience a ton of loss yet. They have experienced it through more secondhand with some people through our church and some friendships, but not a severe loss like a grandparent or a sibling. And so again, for some of you, maybe you have had a lot of loss, and maybe this is a very still real thing that you're working through, and maybe others of you haven't had a lot of loss like me, and you're just wondering, I don't really know what I would even say to my kids, especially young kids. So again, back to just some of the intro things. Like, grief is the term that we use for the internal emotional pain that we feel. It's the internal stuff that we're working through. And then the word mourning is the outward expression, how we mourn, how we grieve, the rituals that we do, doing burials and things like that. So those are just some defining terms. I'm sure most of us have heard of the stages of grief, that when you do go through loss, that you may not experience every stage, or you might move through one stage faster than another. You might get stuck in one, but just to review, denial is the first, that we just have a really hard time accepting what happened. So depending on the loss that you've experienced, if it's a spouse or a child, it can be really hard to accept that that's what's happening, especially if they're dealing with a long-term illness and you can kind of see the road of suffering and praying and pleading for God to do the miraculous. And so denial could be a very real stage for a long time for people, depending on how close you were to the person that was lost. The next stage is anger. And I've known a lot of people in this stage where it's like, why, God? Why did you allow this to happen? Especially if it's like a car accident or, some other just freak accident, how devastating that is. It would be very easy to get stuck in the anger stage. For some people, they move on to bargaining, and bargaining's kind of like, and maybe happens with some kids, especially if there's been a loss of a parent or a sibling. Like, well, what if I had been more obedient? What if I hadn't been so mean? What if I had done more to be helpful? Maybe they wouldn't have gotten sick, or maybe they wouldn't have died. So bargaining could be something we do with God. It could be what we do with friends or family. And then for a lot of people, the stage of depression is where you are for a really long time, where you just feel like you're overtaken by the sadness. It's controlling of your life. It's impacting every area of your life. You just have lost the desire to even care about anything. And so depression is a very real stage. And you might even see this in your kiddos as we talk about this today. Or maybe, again, you yourself could still possibly, as a parent, an adult, be in the stage of depression for a loss that you've had. But eventually, you hope to get to the stage of acceptance, which does not mean, okay, I'm really happy about the loss that I've experienced. It simply is just that you're to that place where you can acknowledge and accept that it happened, that you can't change it, and that you just take steps to move forward, to live in ways to honor the person that you lost. So that's just kind of a quick review of the stages of grief. And again, the point of this topic today is to realize that our kids are going through these stages of grief as well. And it might present very differently because they're obviously younger, they're immature, they don't have maybe words to put to some of the things they feel, but they are still experiencing grief and loss. And so as parents, and the point of today is hopefully to help you guys to have a plan or a strategy or some tips for how to approach when it happens in your family, when loss does come and your kids start to ask questions and are experiencing grief. How do you help support them in that? Okay, so now as I come back to the book and what Alan had to say, one of the first things he says is that the experience of grief, the intensity of it is dependent upon how close of a relationship you have. So that's true for adults, but certainly for kids. If it's a teacher at school is going to be a different form of grief or intensity of grief than if it's a sibling or a parent or maybe a grandparent that they're close to. So that's just kind of another introductory idea that the intensity of the grief that you might see expressed from your kids is going to be dependent on how close they were to the person they lost. And it's also, I thought this was really interesting, that Alan said, if kids are old enough to love, then they're old enough to grieve. And that might just be a good point for you guys, that even our toddlers form connections with parents and siblings and, their grandparents and maybe their teachers at church. So if they have the ability to attach and to love and and allow someone to care for them and be affectionate with someone, then if that person is removed from their life, they're going to experience grief. So those are just a couple of important things to keep in mind, that the age of your kid matters in terms of how they're able to express it, but they are still going to experience grief if they're old enough to understand what love and connection is. Okay, now parents, the next thing I would say is grieving is an active process. So if you're being confronted with the loss right now, make sure that your attitude towards your kids, what Alan calls it as being a companion in grief, that you walk alongside of your kids, that you meet them where they are, that you don't try to walk in front of them, you don't try to shield them or protect them from those feelings or even from the loss itself, but that you walk with them, that you're patient with them, that you help them kind of organize their thoughts and understand what they're feeling and work through it with them. So the goal as parents is to be active in the process and having conversations rather than trying to protect or avoid those conversations. So if there's any of you parents out there right now that are like, oh man, I've just tried to the funeral, all these different things going on, I'm just not even talking to my kids about and just hoping that they won't realize what's going on. That's certainly for the younger ages. And even with your older kids, maybe you're like, if they don't bring it up, I'm not going to bring it up. But as we're going to talk about here, just some helpful tips, that the process of grief is important, and it's important for you to be a companion with your kiddos, meeting them where they are, walking with them, guiding them along, but walking alongside them, not hurrying them to go faster, not, like I said, shielding or protecting them, but just really walking with them and ready to answer their questions, ready to cry with them, ready to say even, I don't know the answer to that. And that's hard for me too. So just keep those things in mind, that grief is an active process. It is going to be unique also to each personality involved. So that includes adults and kids. If you have multiple kids and you've experienced the loss of grandma or grandpa, then each of your kids is going to express grief and kind of go through the process and the stages in a different way, because grief is unique to each person. And maybe that's even good for you as the parents and adults to realize that if you've experienced loss and maybe you felt the pressure, like, gosh, I don't cry as much as my siblings do, or it doesn't come to mind as much as it does for other people. And we can kind of feel guilty about that. Like maybe I'm not grieving right. Maybe I didn't love them as much. We can really kind of drive ourselves crazy with that. It's just important to know that grief is unique to each person. And so that's going to be true for your kids too. Okay. Now that we've kind of set up some basic ideas, here are some tips that I just wanted to share with you. And this comes from the book that Alan wrote. He says, first, have multiple short conversations. Sometimes as parents, we're like, I don't want to have this conversation at all. So let's just sit down and do it once. I can gear up to say it and do it once, and then I don't want to ever talk about it again. But he would say is with your kids, it's better to have short conversations whenever your kids bring it up. Or let's say that you're making grandma's favorite meal one night, that you would bring it up and be like, hey, are you thinking about grandma as we're eating? Like, she made the best chicken noodle soup ever. Looking for opportunities for short conversations. Or if your kid, all of a sudden you're putting them to bed at night and they just have a question about the person that you lost, like just be ready for every conversation, for every moment, again, as a companion in grief, that you're ready for lots of conversations, that you're not just looking to have one long conversation where it turns into a monologue and your kids are just sitting there receiving this information, but not really sure what it means, how to process it, and what it means for them. Okay. The second tip is, and I thought this was really interesting. He says to use simple, honest language. He really says you need to use the word death. So when someone dies, you don't say just, they're asleep or they just went to a better place. Like you use the word death, like so-and-so died. I mean, he even encourages even just passed away, because sometimes kids don't really know what that means. So he says you really need to use the word death or died and to define that for them, meaning like their body just stopped working. Like, you feel right now your heart is beating, you're breathing, your blood is pumping through your body. Well, when we die, our body stops working and our heart stops and we can't walk or talk or breathe anymore. So that's what he said. Now I know, my first reaction as I was reading that and even saying it right now, it's like, oh man, that could be really hard. But what he would say is it's better to use concrete terms with your kids than to use vague language that they don't really understand, because then that kind of halts their ability to continue through the grieving process. So obviously, based on the age of your kids, you don't need to be graphic, but he would say it's important to use terms that are clear, that this person, we're not going to see this person on this side of heaven again. Like, your teacher, you're not going to see them at school anymore because they died. Their body stopped working. Their body was really sick. And so now they've died. So I know, even as I'm saying this, it would be really hard. So I recognize that, parents, there might be some trepidation, but this is a guy that's worked with lots of people and has done a ton of study on grief, and he encourages simple, honest language. Okay, the next thing, and I think this is really important for us as parents to remember, that we should expect regression during this time. So if your kiddos had been potty trained and were doing really well, and then that you guys experience a loss, that a lot of times that's just showing the internal grieving process and the trauma they've experienced, that they regress in behavior. So they might start wetting the bed again, or they might start having temper tantrums or crying uncontrollably when they're at an age where they should be past that. So I do think as parents, it's good for you to be ready for that, because again, if you're a companion in grief with your kids, instead of having a reaction of like, what is wrong with you? Stop that. And shaming them, recognize there's something going on internally. They're grieving internally. So a short conversation would be like, hey, buddy, I noticed that you've wet the bed a couple nights in a row and you've been doing so well. Let's talk about that. What's going on? Are you thinking about things when you go to bed at night, or are you just upset? And have conversations, but be patient with them in that regression, because it's a normal part of grief for kids, because they have all that internal angst trying to figure out what these feelings are, and they're not as quick to get them to words or to even know how to express them. So as parents, you need to be ready to be patient in that and walk with them in that and kind of, identify the behavior that you're seeing and saying, hey, we don't need to cry uncontrollably. Let's talk about what's going on inside that makes you want to express it that way. And what might be a better way to talk through those emotions. Okay, the next thing is to prepare for grief bursts. And honestly, as I've walked with people in grief as adults, this is a very real thing that it's really good for you as adults to be mindful of, but for sure in your kids. And a grief burst is just kind of like that sudden emotional outburst or reaction you have. Might be when the song comes on the radio and all of a sudden you just burst into tears because it reminds you of the person you lost. And it just kind of takes over you. H. Norman Wright wrote a great book years ago called Grief, and it's been super helpful to me in my ministry. And he talks about how grief is like the ocean. So if you picture the ocean where, it's kind of like peaceful for a while, and then all of a sudden the water stirs and it forms a wave and it comes crashing onto the sand, and then it kind of retreats and it's quiet again. And that's like the picture of a grief burst. All of a sudden, you might just be driving to work or sitting there eating dinner, and something just comes, a memory, a smell, a song, whatever it is. And it's a strong emotional reaction that you have in a moment. Kind of like that wave crashing on the sand. And that happens in grief all the time. And that will happen with your kids. All of a sudden, they might just break down crying. So don't panic. Recognize that as a grief burst and talk about it. Again, another one of those short conversations of what brought up in your mind that you have that reaction right now where you're just clearly just really sad in this moment. Help them put it to terms. And then the next tip is to model healthy grieving yourself. So if you've lost someone close to you, your children are watching you too. So it's important, parents, for you also to recognize the stages of grief, to recognize the importance of when a grief burst comes on, that you talk about the person that you've lost, that you talk about the sad feelings you have, you talk about the questions you have. We're being angry with God at different times. It's good for your kids to see you grieve and to be honest about your struggles in it too, because your kids might be left feeling like, is it wrong for me to be sad? Is it wrong for me to feel anger right now? And for you to be able to say, no, that's totally normal. That's part of this process. That's an active process of grieving someone that we've loved and we've cared about. The next tip is, he says how important it is to maintain routine. So depending again on how close this person was to you, the more you can keep their routine the same, the better. And so again, parents, for you, if you're also actively grieving and maybe you're in that depression stage, and so for you, it's overwhelming to try to make dinner or pack a lunch or get kids ready for school, this might be where you need to pull in some other support people that can kind of help keep the routine the same. I'm thinking about, let's say, grade school, junior high kids where they've got sports or clubs or different things they need to go to, that in this trauma of grief, you might just want to check out of all of that. But actually for your kids, it's going to be good for them to have moments to grieve and to talk about it, but to maintain their normal routine so they don't get kind of swallowed up by it and then get stuck. So just be mindful of that. And again, parents, for you, it might mean calling on friends or church families to be supportive of you in that. Okay, now this is another important tip. Alan really encourages you to include your kids in the funeral activities and even the planning. So again, if it's someone close to you that's passed away and you're working on the order of service or putting together a slideshow for a funeral, he says it's really good to include your kids in that, not to shield them from it, and to have them participate, to let them go to a viewing. And as you go, to explain, hey, so we're going to come in this room. It's going to be very quiet. And this is kind of like our way to show respect. And you're going to see somebody that looks like the person we lost, but that's not really where they are anymore. That's just their body, just the shell, and just kind of prepare them to see that. I have mixed reviews on this, by the way. I really think the viewing thing is tough, especially for kids. But for some people would say, and he would say, and he's an expert, that it's good for your kids to kind of have that image, to know grandma or mom or dad or sibling or teacher That's not them anymore. That's just a shell. That's just their body. But whatever the case may be, he would encourage you to include your kids in the planning of and in the participation of whatever services you provide or do for the person that you lost. I especially think the celebration of life is a great option, so that, you might have a viewing that's more somber, but man, we have been a part of so many wonderful celebration of lives where it's more celebratory. It's celebrating who this person was and their legacy, and hearing stories of people, like how this person impacted their life. That would be awesome for your kids, either A, to participate in it themselves, or to write a letter, or just to hear it, just to know like, okay, so-and-so has died. They're not here, but their legacy, their memory lives on. And then the last tip that he gives is that, a lot of times kids express their emotions through art, like through drawings. So make sure to encourage your kids, like, hey, draw a picture of, grandma or of our family, or how you're feeling today. Maybe it's like draw the face of, are you a smiley face today? Are you a sad face today? Help your kids, encourage them to express their emotions through art, if that's something that's helpful for them. Okay, so just a quick review here. Be prepared for short conversations. Use simple, honest language. Expect to see some regression in their behavior. Remember, the grief bursts are a real thing and are going to happen. Model the healthy grieving yourself as the parents. Keep the routine as much as you can. Include your kids as appropriate in the funeral activities or celebration of life. And make sure to use art if that's something that's helpful for your kiddos. Now, I wanted to end today with, how do you talk to your kids about heaven? So if you are a Christian family and the person that's passed away was a follower of Jesus, then beyond talking about, this person died, just say, their body died. But listen, this is what the Bible says, that we live on and we go to heaven. And so Randy Alcorn, his book on heaven is fantastic if you haven't read it, but he did a version for kids. It's called Heaven for Kids. I would encourage you to read that too. But he just kind of draws from what does the Bible speak to about heaven? We don't have a ton of information, but man, the stuff that we have, like heaven is going to be an awesome, beautiful place. So it's good to talk to your kids about if it's a mom or dad or grandma who love Jesus. Like, listen, kiddos, I know it's sad, but they are in heaven. They are with Jesus. They are at peace. And someday we'll get to see them again. To talk about what heaven's like, that it isn't just, naked babies sitting on the cloud playing the harp. It's not a white room that's like an insane asylum. Like, heaven's a beautiful, peaceful place. We're in the presence of our holy God. And so don't be afraid to talk to your kids about heaven. Now, I would caution parents, and I know this is hard. We've been in this position ourselves. If someone we've lost was not a follower of Jesus, then I would not emphasize this to your kids. I would not lie to your kids about where they are. I certainly don't think you need to, especially younger kids, talk about hell, but I do think it would be inappropriate to say that they're in heaven when the Bible is clear that only those that have put their trust in Jesus go to heaven. So for those parents that you're not sure where that person was, you may just want to answer questions about what heaven's going to be like and why it's so important for people to know Jesus. And like, our job here is to share Jesus with as many people as we can. But I wouldn't emphasize that they too are in heaven. And honestly, if your kids, especially kids that are old enough to ask this question, well, so-and-so didn't love Jesus, so where are they? To just say, well, listen, let's go look at what the Bible has to say. And then as parents, you're just going to have to use some discretion about how hard you hit that. But I do think being honest with our kids is better than saying something to appease them in a moment when it isn't true. And that's kind of his point about using terms like death and dying. It's better to be honest with our kids. And again, I just would encourage you as parents, like, to know the balance of that. But at the very least, if you know this person didn't know Jesus, then I would not make a big deal about talking about heaven in terms of where they are, but rather just like, we don't have to be afraid of death as Christians because the Bible promises that we'll be in heaven. And this picture of heaven is beautiful and wonderful, and we'll never have sadness again. There won't be sickness anymore. That, the new heaven will be this beautiful place full of color and just magnificence because it's going to be renewed and restored of what God's original intention of creation was supposed to be without sin and suffering. Okay, so that's a lot of information today. I recognize that, parents. I hope it was helpful to you. And like I said, this question came up in our parenting small group, but listen to this. Maybe listen to it a few times and just recognize that your kids, if they're old enough to love, then they're old enough to grieve. And our job as parents then is to help them do that, to be the companions in grief, like Alan says, and to really walk with our kids and help them, even as we too are going through our own grief process. And again, at the end of the day, what I am grateful for is that if we love Jesus, then we don't have to fear death. And even though it's horribly sad and it's still painful to experience loss on this side of heaven, we can look forward to heaven and seeing the people that were followers of Jesus again someday. Okay, so I just want to end with this thought from 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 14. Brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. For we believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. So remember this, parents, that especially if you're followers of Jesus, that we do not have to grieve like those who have no hope, because we have the hope of seeing our loved ones that follow Jesus, of being in the presence of God someday. So even though the process of grief is painful and difficult and not enjoyable, we can grieve with hope. And we don't have to fear death because of Jesus.
Thanks for listening. If you would like to give to help support our ministry, please visit PursueGOD.org/donate. Find more resources to talk about these topics with your small group, family, or mentor on PursueGOD.org.